In which kings rule in India, women were not allowed to cover their breasts and who abolished it? In this video, you will get complete information about how women were oppressed thousands of years ago, in the lush and humid stretches of what is now known as southern India, where the monsoon clouds gathered like sentinels over palm-covered hills and red earth glistened beneath the rainfall. There once lay a kingdom named Varnada. This kingdom, famed for its artistry, spices, and temples that touch the heavens, was ruled by a line of monarchs whose traditions were carved in stone as rigidly as the scriptures they revered. Among these traditions was one law that history would never forget, a law that forbade women from covering their breasts, regardless of caste or class. The rule was not born out of lust, but from an ancient decree deeply entwined with the ideals of caste purity and societal order. It had begun centuries earlier, long before the age of reason and rebellion, when the ruling high caste elites claimed that allowing women, especially from lower castes, to veil their upper bodies, was a threat to the divine social hierarchy ordained by the gods. Covering one's breasts was, in their interpretation, a sign of pride and equality, a threat to the supremacy of the elite. In the heart of this kingdom stood a massive stone palace built upon 7 terraces, each adorned with statues of kings past, their eyes carved to gaze perpetually at the horizon. The current ruler, Maharaja Virendravarman, was a man whose mind wandered more often than his sword. He had inherited the throne at the age of 28 after his father, a ruthless traditionalist, succumbed to fever during a pilgrimage. Virendra had not been trained in the ways of tyranny. He had grown up under the tutelage of scholars, wandering monks, and storytellers. His mother, a woman of lower nobility who had been allowed into the royal house through a rare marriage of alliance, had taught him to listen not just with his ears, but with his soul. The law forbidding women to cover their chests was one of the first things Virendra had questioned after becoming king. He had seen women in the marketplace avert their gaze when men passed by, their arms folded awkwardly across their bare bosoms, trying to shield a dignity denied to them by decree. Even as a boy, the sight had unsettled him. It was not modesty that had been taken from them, but the choice of modesty. But the king's advisors warned him that any attempt to abolish the law would ignite the fury of the upper castes, particularly the Namboothiri Brahmins, whose words still held near divine authority over spiritual and civic life. To question their decrees was to invite unrest, even assassination. So Virendra waited. He waited and watched. For 6 years, he ruled with a quiet but probing heart. He reformed the tax system, established schools that taught both Sanskrit and the native tongue, and offered patronage to thinkers, poets, and travelers. Yet the law remained. Women still walked bare-breasted through the sweltering sun, forced to endure shame that was never theirs. Among them was a young woman named Kanyakshi, born into the Nadari caste, potters and painters, whose hands told stories their lips were forbidden to speak. Kanyakshi had been raised by her grandmother, a woman with fierce eyes and a mouth that knew too well the taste of rebellion. From her, Kanyakshi had inherited more than just the talent to mix colors with clay. She had inherited a will that refused to bend. When Kanyakshi turned 19, she refused to obey the law. On the day of her sister's wedding, she entered the temple courtyard draped in a simple cotton blouse stitched in secret by an elderly weaver. The blouse was not lavish, just white, unadorned, and tight against her chest. But its symbolism was thunderous. A girl of her caste walking into public space dressed like a woman of the Brahmin families? It was heresy. The temple guards seized her, beat her, and dragged her to the square where the caste court convened. There, in front of hundreds, her blouse was torn off, her body shamed, and her spirit branded. But she did not cry. Word of the incident reached the palace that same evening. Virendravarman was holding council when his chief emissary whispered the tale into his ear. The king's fingers, wrapped around a goblet of sandalwood wine, froze. His court noticed. Silence fell. For a moment, nothing moved but the soft flutter of peacock feathers on the fan held above his head. That night, Virendra summoned the emissary in private. "Tell me the girl's name," he asked. "Kanyakshi, my king," the emissary replied. "And what has become of her?" The emissary hesitated. "She has been sentenced to atonement by silence. No words from her mouth for 30 days. No cloth upon her chest for a year. She was branded as arrogant, unrepentant. The king's gaze shifted to the window, where moonlight played across the garden. "Bring her to the palace," he said finally, discreetly. The emissary bowed and vanished. 2 nights later, Kanyakshi was ushered through a back gate, her face veiled not by cloth, but shadow. The king met her in the courtyard garden, where jasmine vines spilled their scent into the wind. He stood alone without guards, without formality. When she saw him, she did not bow. "Why did you wear the blouse?" he asked her, his voice a calm whisper. She met his gaze. "Because I wanted to decide what part of me the world gets to see," she said. "And because it's mine, not theirs, not even yours." The words struck him like rain on stone. A silence lingered. Then the king nodded. "You speak as queens should," he said. "But in this kingdom, even queens must kneel to the past." Kanyakshi stepped forward. "Then you must crush the past, my king, or drown in it." That night marked the beginning of a transformation. Not just in law, but in the king's soul. Virendra began to invite women of all castes into private meetings disguised as art guilds. He listened to them, not just their pain, but their dreams. He heard of how girls wrapped themselves in palm leaves while playing in the forest just to feel what it was like to be covered. How mothers cried alone at night knowing their daughters were fated to the same humiliation. The king began planting seeds. Quietly, he sent word to poets in his court to compose verses praising the divine feminine in all her veiled and unveiled glory. He commissioned murals depicting goddesses with blouses, divine figures from ancient texts that could not be contradicted. He invited Brahmin priests to debate philosophy in the open court and asked carefully crafted questions about modesty, honor, and choice. The conversations stirred curiosity, the murals stirred whispers, and then came the rainstorm. In the 11th year of his reign, a drought struck Varnada. The rivers shrank and the wells ran dry. Crops failed. People began to suffer. The Nambuthiris declared it a curse, an omen of divine punishment for the king's indulgence in rebellious ideas. "The gods are displeased," they cried. "The king is inviting ruin by polluting the order of things." But Virendra did not falter. Instead, he walked barefoot to the temple of Ardhanarishvara, the deity who was both male and female in one form. There he poured water from the palace cistern onto the idol and proclaimed, "The gods are not offended by cloth. They are offended by cruelty." That night, 100 women marched to the palace wearing homemade blouses of all shapes and colors, stitched from old rags, dyed with turmeric and ash. Kanyakshi led them. At the gates of the palace, they sang songs of freedom. The king stood on the balcony and watched, not as a ruler, but as a witness to history. The next morning, he issued the royal decree, "From this day forward, no woman in Varnada shall be forbidden from choosing what she may wear upon her body. Let modesty be her right, not her burden, and let no man or god claim otherwise." The declaration shook the kingdom. The Brahmins protested, elders cursed, but the people, the silent majority, breathed a sigh long held in their chests. Women danced in the fields, daughters wept in their mother's arms. Kanyakshi returned to her village not as a criminal, but as a legend, and Maharaja Virendra Varman, once seen as soft and bookish, became known as the king who gave back the sky. He ruled for 30 more years, and under his reign, Varnada became a place where tradition and truth walked hand in hand, not always in peace, but never in chains. And though centuries would pass and stories would twist into myths, one thing remained etched into the memory of the land: the day the cloth returned, not as a law, but as a choice. The weeks following the royal proclamation were uneasy. The decree was made, but the scars of centuries-old beliefs do not vanish at the stroke of a pen. In the city, artisans cheered, weavers lit lamps in their shops, and mothers stitched blouses for their daughters late into the night, whispering ancient lullabies they had once buried in silence. But in the countryside, in the strongholds of orthodoxy, priests tore their shawls in fury and declared the king an enemy of Dharma. From mountaintop temples to rural village squares, the debate raged. Could the divine order truly allow such a change? And yet, among all the voices, none were as bold as those who had once been silent. Women who had endured humiliation found words, songs, and poems rising from their hearts like rivers after drought. Kanyakshi, now known across the land, traveled from village to village, speaking not just about cloth, but about dignity. She spoke to mothers, to fathers, to boys who had never thought about shame because it was never thrust upon them. Her words did not drip with anger, but glowed with conviction. "To be seen is not a sin," she said once in a hall of elders, "but to be seen without the right to hide is violence." Many wept. Even the priests, once staunch opponents, began to hesitate in their fire. The king, meanwhile, faced a different battle. A coalition of landlords, upper caste ministers, and conservative generals plotted to undermine him. Rumors of curses, conspiracies, and even foreign invasion were spread to frighten the common folk into rejecting the reform. They claimed the rains would never return, that the gods were turning their faces away. But Virendra did not waver. He visited farms, walked barefoot among the peasants, carried water, and planted rice shoots with his own hands. "Let the gods see me labor for my people," he said. "If they punish me for that, then I have chosen the correct punishment." His bravery did not go unnoticed. A group of Brahmins who had been educated in faraway lands returned to Varnata and stood by the king. They called themselves the New Flame. "The Shastras are not iron chains," they proclaimed. "They are tools of balance, and balance must evolve." They quoted scriptures, found lost verses that suggested women had once covered and uncovered themselves freely, depending on their will, their mood, or their worship. The walls of resistance began to crack. Merchants, tired of fear-mongering and chaos, supported the king. Farmers who had daughters, sisters, and wives realized they too had been complicit in shame. Even some of the old priests relented, but not all. A powerful faction remained, hidden behind rituals and incense smoke. They planned to use the sacred fire festival, the most revered event of the year, to turn the tide. They would declare the king's reforms heretical during the lighting of the holy flame in front of thousands. Their goal, to sever Virendra from the gods, from the people, and from power. The king heard whispers of this plan. His generals urged him to cancel the festival. His ministers begged him to arrest the dissenters. But Virendra refused. If a king must silence his people to survive, then he is not a king, only a coward in a crown. Instead, he made a bold move. He invited Kanyakshi to light the holy flame. It was an act unprecedented in the kingdom's history. A woman, a potter, lighting the sacred fire that only Brahmin men had touched for centuries. The court gasped when the edict was announced. The city froze. Markets stopped. For 2 days, silence reigned. Then on the morning of the festival, thousands gathered in the grand square. The sacred flame, carried in a golden urn from the Temple of Ancients, was set atop the altar. Priests stood in their robes, silent and watchful. The nobles sat with stiff backs and narrowed eyes. And then, through the crowd, walked Kanyakshi. Dressed in a simple red sari, blouse stitched from the same cloth, her forehead marked with ash and turmeric, she carried herself like a queen born of clay and fire. As she ascended the steps to the altar, a murmur moved through the people like wind through tall grass. Some whispered her name like prayer. Others clenched their fists in protest. At the top of the altar, she turned to the people. Her voice rang like a bell in the morning air. "This fire has burned for centuries to cleanse our sins, but what greater sin than shame forced upon innocence? Today I light this flame not to erase our past, but to light the path forward." With that, she touched the wick. The fire blazed, brighter than ever before. For a heartbeat, all was still. Then came a sound, cheering, rising like a tide. First from the women, then the children, then the men. Even the wind seemed to carry applause. The priests did not interrupt. They watched, and for the first time in years, many lowered their eyes, not in defeat, but in reflection. From that moment on, the kingdom changed. Slowly at first, like the turn of a great wheel, but then faster, like fire on dry grass. More women began to wear blouses without fear. Markets opened shops selling them in colors unseen before. Tailors became poets of cloth. Painters etched images of goddesses in modern dress. Girls in villages danced without covering their chests with crossed arms. Grandmothers wept, not from sorrow but from vindication. The king, now revered as Dharma Nirmata, the lawgiver, continued his work. He revised marriage laws, allowing women to initiate divorce. He reformed inheritance laws so daughters received equal share. He opened education to all castes and abolished the branding of so-called untouchables. Of course, rebellion still simmered. A secret society of traditionalist lords plotted from the north, calling Virendra's rule a betrayal of Dharma. They reached out to rival kingdoms, even foreign traders, offering bribes to disrupt the peace. In a calculated attack, they poisoned the wells near the capital, hoping to ignite disease and blame the reformists. Dozens died. Panic spread. Virendra himself fell ill, but survived. When the culprits were found, the king held a public trial, not to humiliate, but to educate. He spared their lives, declaring, "Let mercy be the flame that burns treachery. If we fight hate with hate, we feed the enemy within." That day, even his enemies bowed, not out of fear, but respect. Kanyakshi, who had become his closest advisor and confidant, watched the kingdom blossom from her humble workshop by the river. She never took a royal title, though she could have. "I was born of clay," she often said, "and clay must remain close to earth." She taught girls to paint, to sculpt, to write. Her students created stories of women who danced with uncovered chests, not in shame, but in power. One such student, a girl named Malabika, would later become the first female court poet in Varnada's history. Years passed. Virendra aged gracefully, his beard silver like moonlight, his voice deeper but still firm. One winter, as the wind howled through the palace halls and the fires crackled with the scent of pine, the king summoned Kanyakshi for a final conversation. "Do you think they'll remember?" he asked her, gazing at the stars. "They'll remember the fire," she replied, "the day the sky returned to the women of this land." The king smiled. "Then I have ruled well." He died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on a scroll of law he had been revising to include protections for the disabled. His funeral brought together all of Varnada. From the highest hills to the deepest coastal villages, people gathered. Women wore their finest blouses, not to impress, but to honor. Priests sang hymns praising both goddesses and queens, and Kanyakshi lit his funeral pyre with the same flame she had once offered to the gods, tears tracing silent lines down her cheeks. A statue was built in the center of the capital, a woman standing tall, holding a blouse in one hand and a scroll in the other. Beneath it, words carved in stone, "Dignity is not given, it is reclaimed." Even centuries later, when foreign empires would try to rewrite history, when wars would come and borders would shift, the story of Virendra and Kanyakshi remained. It lived in songs sung by boatmen, in carvings on temple walls, in lullabies whispered by mothers who once had no voice. And though time might bury names, it cannot bury truth. For in the heart of the earth where Varnada once stood, there still echoes the footsteps of a woman who refused to hide and a king who listened. Years passed like rivers through valleys, some swift, others slow. Varnada grew, and with it, the legend of the king and the potter's daughter deepened in every household. Even those who once cursed the changes found themselves beneficiaries of the new winds. Farmers' wives no longer feared stepping out of their huts during trade days. Girls walked to schools built in memory of Virendra Varman, their blouses stitched with pride by mothers who had once stitched in secret. The memory of bare-breasted shame faded, though it never truly vanished, etched as it was in the memory of grandmothers and great-aunts who had lived those silent, burning days. The statue of the woman with the blouse and scroll became a gathering point, not just for weddings, festivals, or royal announcements, but for stories. It was here that minstrels sat at dusk, telling tales of how the sky looked the day Kanyakshi lit the sacred fire, how the flames bent with the wind but never fell, how thunder rolled not in anger, but applause. Generations passed, but the stories remained warm, whispered like sacred mantras into ears eager for heritage. And yet history, like rivers, must confront rocks and turns. Decades after Virendra's death, a new ruler ascended the throne, his great-grandson, Maharaja Vishwadvarman. Unlike his ancestor, Vishrut was raised not among books and sages, but warriors and traders. He was clever, ambitious, and eager to raise Varnata's name beyond the seas. But he was also impatient with sentiment, uninterested in stories of reform. Where Virendra saw honor and dignity, Vishrut saw only opportunity and expansion. He wanted wealth, alliances, power. He restructured the military, taxed foreign traders heavily, and tightened control over religious institutions, much to the alarm of the people. While he never revoked the laws Virendra had passed, he stopped celebrating them. The annual fire festival became a ceremony only for the elite. The statue of Kanyakshi fell into neglect. Paint peeled from her blouse. Moss grew between the stone of her toes. Still, people gathered. Still, women whispered, "We remember." But whispers do not carry to palaces made of marble and pride. And then came the threat from the west, a coalition of mountain lords who resented Varnata's growing dominance. They began to raid border villages, loot merchant caravans, and spread propaganda that Varnata had strayed too far from its roots. Vishrut responded with war. For 5 years, battles raged. Fields became camps. Gold was melted to forge weapons. Temples were looted to pay mercenaries. And in this time of desperation, the Maharaja made a choice that would shake the soul of the kingdom. He met with the leaders of the old conservative sects, the same forces his great-grandfather had defeated in thought, not war. These priests, banished to the hills, returned bearing gold, horses, and promises. "Let the kingdom return to its divine order," they said. "Restore the sacred customs, rebuild the caste lines, let women return to modesty as dictated by Dharma, not desire. Do this, and we will bless your reign with spiritual power and loyal men." Vishrut, worn by war and hungry for legacy, agreed. In secret, new edicts were written. They began innocuously: tax cuts for temples that preached ancestral purity, grants for traditional art forms that depicted women in pre-reform ways. Then came more sinister laws. Girls in village schools were told to study from approved scriptures. State-funded weavers were ordered to produce only upper body garments for men. Statues of Virendra were quietly removed from the capital and relocated to outer towns. The statue of Kanyakshi was surrounded by scaffolding. For renovation, they said, but no work ever began. But oppression, like drought, cannot remain hidden forever. A new generation of women, daughters and granddaughters of the revolution, began to notice. They saw how shops stopped selling blouses in their sizes, how temples refused entry to girls who dressed as their mothers once had, how street plays no longer told the story of Kanyakshi, but of pious women who never questioned fate, and they began to gather. Among them rose a girl named Mihala, a sculptor's apprentice with sharp eyes and a voice like thunder. She was 17 when she climbed the scaffold around Kanyakshi's statue, ripped off the covering cloth, and poured fresh paint over the stone blouse with her own hands. "If they won't honor her, we will!" she shouted to the crowd. Soldiers tried to arrest her, but the people formed a wall. That night the city burned, not with fire but with song. Poets once silenced returned to the street. Old murals were uncovered, showing goddesses dressed with dignity. Secret schools reopened. Messages were carved in clay pots and left at crossroads. Remember the king who listened. Remember the fire. Across Varnata, the revolution rekindled, not with swords, but with memory. Mihala, now hunted, escaped into the countryside, traveling from village to village, much like Kanyakshi had. But her mission was different. Not to ask for dignity, it had already been won once, but to defend it, to remind the people that freedom taken once can be taken again. That silence once lifted must never return. And it worked. Vishrut, who believed himself untouchable, began to feel the kingdom turn against him. His alliances frayed. His priests grew nervous. His generals questioned their orders. One by one, towns declared their loyalty not to the palace, but to the story. Not to the crown, but to the blouse. When Mahala's rebels marched peacefully to the capital, carrying torches and songs instead of swords, the people did not run. They opened their homes. Even the guards at the gates let them in. Vishrut watched from his balcony as the procession entered the square. There, beneath the statue of Kanyakshi, now cleaned, repaired, and glowing in the sunset, Mihala stood. "We do not seek a new king," she said. "We seek to protect the legacy of one who ruled with heart." Vishrut, realizing the tide, abdicated quietly. He left the kingdom not in exile, but in reflection, vowing to travel, to understand the roots of what he had lost. In his place, a council of elders and reformers was established, including artisans, scholars, and yes, women. Mihala, though urged to lead, declined. "A voice is not a throne," she said. "I will build, not rule." She returned to her sculpture workshop, where her first commission was a new statue of Virendra Varman, holding a flaming torch in one hand, and in the other, a scroll bearing the words, "Let dignity be her right." It stood beside Kanyakshi, not taller, not smaller, but equal, and so the kingdom of Varnanta entered a new age. Not perfect, not without struggle, but grounded in memory and guarded by generations who knew that silence is the sharpest chain and voice the fiercest flame. And far into the future, when tourists from distant lands came to the region and asked, "What is this statue of a woman with a blouse and a scroll?" children would laugh and say, "Sit down. Let me tell you about a king, his potter friend, and the law they burn." There are some such facts and truths related to this story which we could not tell you. If you still want to know that, then comment below. Very soon you will get a video on that too, and thank you very much for watching this video. Please share the video as well.